Section number 59. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA. Book number 8, Chapter 14, Part 2, Spheres of Action, Bigamy. In Spain, as we have seen, the secular laws provided penalties, but these were disregarded by the Inquisition, when it secured exclusive jurisdiction, and in practice the tribunals exercised a wide discretion. Ordinarily men were punished with 100 or 200 lashes, and from 3 to 5 years of galleys at the oar, though these of gentle blood were exempt from scourging and were sent to presidios or to military service in the galleys. The Seville auto of May 13, 1565, may be taken as an example where there were 14 bigamists. 10 of them were scourged with an aggregate of 1700 lashes, and 5, in addition, were sent to the galleys, with an aggregate of 29 years. A woman had 200 lashes, with prohibition to leave Seville for 10 years, and 2 others were paraded in vergiienza. The other heaviest punishment was that of the Bachiller Cristobal de Ordaz, a physician, who was fined in 200 ducats. Provided that this did not exceed half his property, he suffered 200 lashes and was sent to the galleys for 6 years irremissibly, after which he was banished for life with a threat of perpetual galleys in case of infraction. Full allowance was made for extenuating circumstances. If husband or wife had been absent for years and reasonable effort had been made to ascertain their fate, or false news of death had been received, the accused was acquitted or the penalty reduced. This is illustrated in the case of Anton de Cuba, a peasant of Cienpozuelos, before the Toledo tribunal in 1606. Both his wives were of his native place. He left it for a while, and on his return found his first wife absent. Then news came of her death in the hospital of Anton Martin in Madrid. He went there and verified it, returning with a certificate, on the strength of which and of public notoriety 4 years afterwards a licence for a second marriage was granted. Then the first wife returned and he was placed on trial. All this was carefully verified and the case was suspended. There can, indeed, be little doubt that honestly misguided bigamists fared better at the hands of the Inquisition than they would have done in the secular courts, while the thorough organization of the tribunals enabled it to collect evidence through the land, whether for severity or mercy, in a manner impossible to either the civil or episcopal authorities. Its unwearied perseverance was sometimes severely taxed in the case of soldiers removed from post to post, and is fairly illustrated in that of Joseph Antonio Ferro, a private in the regiment of Castile, accused in 1763 to the Barcelona tribunal. His corpse shifted its quarters and he was transferred to the regiment del Rey. His movements were followed up for years. The tribunals of Barcelona, Seville, and Valladolid were successfully employed on the case, and in 1769 that of Madrid was charged with its conduct. Discretion could be used to sharpen as well as to mitigate penalties, as may be seen in the case of the most accomplished bigamist in the records, Antonio, who appeared in the Valladolid auto of October 4, 1579. He confessed promptly and freely that within 10 years he had married 15 wives. It was the profession by which he earned a livelihood, for he wandered through the land marrying and running away with whatever he could secure. He must have been a most plausible scamp, for his favourite device was to personate some one who had disappeared, after gathering information sufficient to enable him to maintain the deception. This plan he repeated 11 times, in some cases establishing claims to considerable property. His sentence was to appear in the auto with a mitre bearing the insignia of all the 15 marriages, usually the figure of a woman for each, 200 lashes and the galleys for life. In view of the latter clause it seems slightly superfluous to remit to the ordinary, as usual, the question as to which of the women he should live with. As the 18th century advanced, the inquisitional claim to exclusive jurisdiction was called in question. In the New Granadian case of Alberto Maldonado of Santa Fe de Bogota, the alcalde resisted the interference of the Inquisition with his prosecution of the culprit. The matter was brought before the Royal Audiencia, which decided in favor of the tribunal, on grounds of expediency. Appeal was made to the home government, resulting in a decree, February 15, 1754, to the effect that bigamy was mixti forte and that cognizance belonged to the jurisdiction taking first action. Against this the Suprema presented a consulta, March 18th, but to no purpose. The decree was enclosed to all viceroys in a royal cedula, commanding that in no case should a competencia be admitted, for no custom could prevail against the regalias, without the royal consent. If the Inquisition desired to take action for the suspicion of heresy involved, it could do so after the culprit had served out the punishment imposed by the royal courts. The Inquisition was irrepressible and, in spite of these positive commands, a competencia arose in New Granada, which induced Carlos III to reconsider the questions. Consultas were called for and were presented by the Suprema in April 1765, and by the Council of Indies in April 1766, resulting in a decree of July 21, 1766, by which Carlos restored the exclusive jurisdiction of the Inquisition. This was sent to the viceroys September 8th, and we find it ordered to be duly obeyed in Mexico by the Marquis de Croix, February 26, 1767. Carlos soon saw reason to change his views. The Auditor de la Guerra had tried and sentenced an invalid soldier, when the Inquisition interposed and demanded the papers. This aroused him to a sense of the incongruity of the position, and he ordered the Royal Council to consider the matter. It presented an unanimous report, January 10, 1770, in conformity with which he decreed, February 5th, that the case belonged exclusively to the Auditoria de la Guerra. He utilized the occasion, moreover, by adding that he had ordered the Inquisitor General to instruct inquisitors that, in cases of this kind, they must observe the laws of the kingdom and not embarrass the royal judges in matters appertaining to them, but must limit the use of their faculties strictly to hearsay and apposay, and not dishonor the royal vassals by arrests without manifest preliminary proof. All the royal tribunals were ordered to try and punish bigamists according to the laws and to be zealous in preventing any contravention of the decree. This was a bitter rebuke, sullenly resented by the Inquisition. There were many pending cases in the tribunals, and they forthwith suspended proceedings. This led to a royal letter of September 30, 1771, in which authority was granted to proceed with all cases not on trial in the royal courts, and all that might be denounced to the Inquisition, but subject to the condition that, when the culprit was not redu de fe, through belief that bigamy is lawful, sentence could not be rendered or punishment be inflicted but that the case should be then handed over to the courts having jurisdiction. Although this conceded only the power of trying without convicting, it was an entering wedge, which the Suprema lost no time in turning to an advantage, by stimulating denunciations and making the people believe that it still held jurisdiction. In the Edict of Faith for 1772, therefore, bigamy was included, with the cautious formula, so that the Holy Office may prevent the offences against God committed in this crime. The royal decree was sent around to the tribunals, with instructions that, when denunciations were received, care was to be taken to see that the accused was not on trial elsewhere. In that case he was to be regularly tried and convicted and made to appear in an auto particular, with the insignia of bigamy and double-knotted halter indicating scourging. He was to be made to abjure and be remanded to prison for 2 or 3 weeks of penance, and then be handed over to the secular court, so that his subsequent punishment may have the appearance of being merely the execution of a sentence by the tribunal. While these devices doubtless had the effect designed, the offensive decree of 1770 remained in force and was a standing humiliation which the Suprema strove earnestly to remove. In 1777 it presented a memorial representing that the decree was printed and sold and published in the journals, causing infinite prejudice to religion and giving immense impulse to profligacy and infidelity. It debarred the Inquisition from acting in any cases save those of heresy and apostasy, and even in these it could make no arrests unless guilt was conclusively proved. Since that year, it says, how many have abandoned themselves to solicitation, sorcery and other crimes, believing themselves secure from the Inquisition? How many have allowed themselves to utter propositions impious or heretical, believing that, even when denounced, they could not be arrested until their offences were fully proved, a thing which could rarely or ever happen? It is in vain that the Inquisition publishes its yearly edict of faith. The impression produced by the cedula is uneffaced, and it ought to be called in and suppressed. The appeal led to a royal declaration of September 6, 1777, to the effect that the cedula of 1770 did not impede the jurisdiction of the Inquisition in cases of which cognizance was reserved to it. As to bigamy, the offence was partitioned between 3 jurisdictions. The deceit of the woman and the injury of offspring were subjected to the secular courts, the validity or invalidity of the marriage to the episcopal courts, and heresy as to the sacrament, when it existed, to the Inquisition. The 3 jurisdictions should cooperate, by each imposing the penalties belonging to it and delivering the culprit from one to another in order that his offences might be verified. This subdivision of a crime into 3 was too clumsily scientific to be reduced to practice. In appearance, it only defined the existing method, but in a shape which enabled the Inquisition to encroach on the secular jurisdiction. As early as 1781 we find that the bigamist, after trial, was handed over to the royal court with a certificate designating him not merely as a convict but expressing the punishment of exile and presidio, thus showing that the tribunal presumed to sentence him to temporal as well as to spiritual penance. In 1791 a case indicates that it even went further, for the Toledo tribunal held an auto particular for Gabriel Delgado, in which his sentence was read, prescribing not only abjuration de levi and spiritual penance, but exile for 8 years from Toledo, Madrid and royal residences. The only difference between this and the practice of a century earlier was a clause that his person was to be delivered to the secular justice. Under the Restoration the Inquisition assumed full jurisdiction over bigamy. The tribunal sentenced the culprit as of old, usually to scourging and presidio or exile, and the Suprema, in confirming the sentence, ordered the scourging omitted on some pretext. Nothing was said about handing the culprit over to the secular courts. They might, if they saw fit, exercise cumulative jurisdiction and entertain cases that came to them, but after they rendered judgment the Inquisition tried the culprits over again and modified the sentence at its pleasure, either to increase or diminish the penalties. Thus in 1818 the Granada Criminal Court sentenced Eusebio Rullin to 6 years of presidio, of which one was to be in Africa. Then the tribunal took hold of him, added spiritual penances and perpetual exile from certain places, and increasing the presidio to 10 years, but, when this went for confirmation to the Suprema, it cut down the exile to 8 years and the presidio to 2. The sentence of the criminal court was treated with the utmost contempt. An exception to this seems to have been made when the army was concerned. In 1817 Eladio de Aragon was tried by the Madrid tribunal and convicted of having 3 wives. His sentence comprised only abjuration and spiritual penances, after the performance of which he was to be handed over to the captain general with a copy of his sentence and recommendation to mercy. In view of his long imprisonment, his confession, and the hopes entertained of his amendment, evidently, in dealing with the army, the Inquisition felt constrained to obey the laws. Bigamy formed a portion by no means inconsiderable of the current business of the Inquisition. In the Toledo record, from 1575 to 1610, the number of cases is 54, ranking next to those of Moriscos. In the same tribunal, from 1648 to 1794, there were 62 cases, being next in number to solicitation. In the 64 autos held in Spain from 1721 to 1727, there were 34 cases, the only crimes exceeding this being Judaism and sorcery. In the latter period, owing doubtless to the interference of the secular jurisdiction and the decadence of the Inquisition, the number falls off, the total in all tribunals from 1780 to 1820 being 105. End of section 59. Recording by Linda Ray Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.